To the casual observer, Daniel Kane was just another middle-aged man with a limp, spending his days mopping floors and fixing broken equipment. His gentle demeanor and tendency to avoid attention made him practically invisible, exactly as he wanted it. But there was something about Daniel that didn't quite fit. The way he moved when he thought no one was watching. The careful control in his every gesture. The way his eyes tracked trouble before it started. These weren't the habits of a simple janitor. They were the instincts of a warrior trying to forget who he once was. What the Iron Wolves motorcycle gang didn't know when they roared into town, looking for easy targets, was that they'd chosen to terrorize a community protected by one of the most legendary fighters in MMA history. Known once as the Ghost for his supernatural ability to seem to vanish and reappear in the ring, Daniel had walked away from fame and glory after a tragic accident left another fighter dead. For 3 years, he'd found peace in the simple act of keeping the community center clean and its children safe. But when the bikers' intimidation escalated from threats to violence, they would learn why some men choose peace not out of weakness, but because they know exactly how much damage they can do. Daniel's past wasn't just a secret. It was about to become the Iron Wolves' worst nightmare. This is the story of how a quiet janitor's carefully buried past became the key to his community's future, proving that sometimes the most dangerous fighters are the ones who choose to walk in peace, until peace is no longer a choice. Before we dive deeper into this story, tell us in the comments where you are tuning in from today, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss upcoming stories. The rhythmic squeak of wheels echoed through the community center's hallway as Daniel pushed his mop bucket forward, his movements deliberate and measured. The morning sun streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the freshly cleaned floor. From the gymnasium came the familiar sound of bouncing basketballs and children's laughter, a soundtrack he'd grown accustomed to over the past 3 years. Daniel's limp was subtle but present, more pronounced in the early morning hours before his muscles had a chance to warm up. He paused momentarily, leaning slightly on his mop handle, watching the kids play through the gymnasium's open doors. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he observed their carefree game. "Mr. Daniel," a young girl named Sarah called out, waving enthusiastically. "Watch this shot." He nodded, maintaining his quiet demeanor as she attempted a long-range basket. The ball arced through the air, missing the hoop entirely, but her enthusiasm remained undimmed. "Almost had it," he said softly, returning to his work. The morning progressed with its usual routine until he noticed movement in the far corner of the gym. A group of older boys had cornered Liam, a quiet 12-year-old who preferred reading to basketball. Daniel had noticed the boy before, always alone, always trying to make himself invisible. "Where's your lunch money, nerd?" one of the older boys demanded, shoving Liam against the wall. Daniel watched, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. Years of experience had taught him that direct confrontation often made things worse for the victim. Instead, he wheeled his bucket closer to the group, pretending to be absorbed in his work. I don't have any," Liam stammered, clutching his book to his chest like a shield. Just as the largest boy pulled back his fist, Daniel accidentally knocked over his mop bucket. Water spread across the floor, causing the bullies to jump back instinctively. "Sorry about that," Daniel said mildly, already reaching for his mop. "Need to clean this up before someone slips. Would you boys mind moving?" "Safety first." The boys scattered, their attention diverted from their previous target. Liam remained pressed against the wall, watching Daniel work with wide eyes. "Thank you," he whispered after the others had left. Daniel just nodded, continuing to mop. "Be careful of puddles," he said, as if nothing significant had happened. Later that morning, while cleaning the storage closet, Daniel came across a familiar box pushed far back on a shelf. The label read Kane in faded marker. His hand hovered over it momentarily before pulling back, but not before a golden trophy peeked out from beneath the partially opened lid. He quickly shut the door, his expression unreadable. Throughout the day, kids approached him with various questions and problems. A younger boy needed help with his shoelaces. A teenage girl asked for advice about dealing with strict parents. Each time, Daniel listened carefully but spoke little, offering brief wisdom before redirecting attention away from himself. "Mr. Daniel," a young boy named Marcus asked, Were you always a janitor? Everyone has a story, Daniel replied, gently steering the conversation back to Marcus's basketball practice. In the administrative office, Maria Bennett, the center's manager, sat surrounded by papers, her usually cheerful face creased with worry. Daniel entered quietly to empty the trash bin. I don't know how much longer we can keep the doors open, Maria said, more to herself than to Daniel. These bills, the funding cuts, we're barely making ends meet. Daniel paused in his work, watching her concern deepen as she shuffled through papers. The roof needs repairs, the heating system is ancient, and now the city's cutting our budget again. She looked up, seeming to notice Daniel for the first time. Oh, sorry, Daniel. I shouldn't burden you with this. He shook his head slightly. No burden, he said softly, then added, the center matters. Maria smiled wearily. Yes, it does. To so many kids. She trailed off as Daniel quietly left the room, but those who knew him well might have noticed him working even later than usual that evening, ensuring every surface gleamed. Near the break room, two staff members chatted over coffee, unaware of Daniel's presence in the hallway. There's something about him, Jenny, the art instructor, said. Don't you think it's weird how he never talks about himself? Tom, the basketball coach, shrugged. Maybe he's just private, or maybe he's hiding something, Jenny persisted. Nobody's that quiet without a reason. I heard he used to be somebody, but something happened. Now he's just, well, broken, you know? Daniel continued his work, face impassive, as if he hadn't heard a word. Later that afternoon, a new youth counselor named Rachel watched in surprise as Daniel single-handedly moved a heavy weight machine that had been delivered to the wrong room. That thing must weigh at least 300 pounds, she muttered to Jenny. He doesn't look that strong. There's a lot about Daniel that doesn't add up, Jenny replied, but their conversation was interrupted by the distant rumble of motorcycles. The sound grew louder, echoing off the buildings of the small town. Daniel paused in his work, looking out the window as a group of motorcycles roared past. Their leather jackets bore the insignia of the Iron Wolves, and at their head rode a massive man with a scarred face and cruel eyes. The leader, who would later be known as Brick, slowed his bike as he passed the community center. His gaze lingered on the building, a smirk playing across his features as he assessed the property. The rumble of engines faded as they moved on, but something in the air had changed, a tension, a sense of approaching storm. That evening, as Daniel prepared to leave, he found Liam waiting by the front door, clutching his backpack. Mr. Daniel? The boy's voice was barely above a whisper. Do you think I could learn to be strong? Like you? Daniel studied the boy for a moment. Strength isn't about muscles, he said finally. It's about heart. He paused, then added, and sometimes the quietest people are the strongest. As Liam left, Daniel locked up the center for the night. His limp was more pronounced after a long day's work, but he moved with a certain grace that seemed at odds with his job. The setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and in the distance, the sound of motorcycles could still be heard, like thunder before a storm. He walked to his modest truck, parked in the far corner of the lot. Before getting in, he cast one final glance at the community center, this place of laughter and learning, of sanctuary and hope. His expression hardened slightly as he heard the motorcycles again, closer now. The Iron Wolves were marking their territory, testing boundaries, looking for weakness. But they didn't know what Daniel knew, that sometimes the most dangerous opponents are the ones who seem the least threatening. As he drove home in the gathering dusk, his mind wandered to the box labeled Cain, to a past he'd tried to leave behind, and to a promise he'd made to himself years ago. The quiet janitor had chosen this life of anonymity and peace, but as the rumble of motorcycles echoed through the streets of his adopted hometown, he couldn't help but wonder how long that peace would last. The Iron Wolves were looking for easy prey, but they might just find that they'd wandered into the den of a far more dangerous predator, one who had learned the value of appearing harmless. Daniel parked his truck in front of his small house, its paint peeling and grass slightly overgrown. To anyone passing by, it looked like the home of a simple janitor, a man of no particular importance. But inside, in a locked room he rarely entered, hung a faded poster of a younger, fiercer Daniel, the ghost Cain, his fists raised in victory, his eyes alive with a fire he'd spent years trying to extinguish. As he prepared for bed that night, his routine was the same as always. Simple dinner, hot shower for his aching leg, clean uniform laid out for tomorrow. But something had changed. The arrival of the Iron Wolves had stirred something in him, a familiar tension he recognized from his fighting days. He flexed his hands unconsciously, muscle memory from thousands of hours of training still present despite the years of disuse. The next morning would bring another day of quiet service, of mopping floors and fixing leaks, of watching over the children who had come to trust his silent presence. But for now, in the darkness of his bedroom, Daniel allowed himself to remember who he used to be and to wonder if that man would be needed again. The sound of distant motorcycles continued late into the night, a reminder that peace is often temporary, and that sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, no matter how deeply we try to bury it. Daniel closed his eyes, his hands still clenched, and prepared himself for whatever tomorrow might bring. The quiet janitor might prefer peace, but the ghost had never lost a fight, and deep down, beneath the humble exterior, that undefeated warrior still lived, waiting, watching, ready if needed. In the community center, the box labeled Kane sat undisturbed in its dark corner, holding secrets and memories of a life left behind. But as the Iron Wolves settled into town, bringing their particular brand of chaos and intimidation, those secrets might not stay hidden for long. The stage was set, the players were moving into position, and the quiet janitor who had found peace in anonymity might soon be forced to remember who he really was, and why they used to call him the Ghost. The morning started like any other at the community center, but the peaceful routine was about to be shattered. The rumble of motorcycles grew steadily louder until it seemed to shake the building's foundation. Maria Bennett stood at her office window, watching as a dozen bikes pulled into the parking lot, chrome glinting in the morning sun. The riders dismounted with practiced swagger, their leather jackets bearing the snarling wolf insignia that had become an increasingly common sight around town. Their leader, Brick, stood head and shoulders above the rest, his scarred face set in what might have been meant as a friendly smile but came across as predatory. Maria smoothed her skirt nervously as she walked out to meet them, maintaining a professional demeanor despite her unease. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Brick's smile widened, showing teeth that seemed too white and perfect for his rough appearance. "Ma'am, we're just here to support the community. The Iron Wolves have a special interest in local youth programs." His lieutenant, a lean man with snake tattoos coiling up his neck, known simply as Snake, nodded enthusiastically. "We're all about the kids, aren't we, boss?" Something in their tone made Maria's skin crawl, but she maintained her composure. "Well, we appreciate community involvement, but we do have certain protocols for volunteers. Protocols?" Brick laughed, the sound echoing off the walls. "We're more of a spontaneous bunch. Speaking of which, mind if we look around?" Before Maria could respond, the bikers were already moving past her into the center. Their boots tracked mud across the freshly mopped floor where Daniel had been working just moments before. He stood quietly to the side, watching with careful eyes as they passed. Brick noticed him and paused, taking a long drink from his soda can. With deliberate slowness, he turned it upside down, letting the sticky liquid splash across the clean floor. "Hey, janitor, you missed a spot." The other bikers roared with laughter as Daniel quietly retrieved his mop, beginning to clean the spill without a word or change in expression. This seemed to irritate Brick more than any response might have. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Brick taunted, but Daniel continued working as if he hadn't heard. Snake sidled up to Maria, who was watching the scene with growing concern. "Nice place you got here," he said, running a finger along a wall. "Be a shame if anything happened to it. You know how accidents can happen to buildings without proper protection." Maria's breath caught as she realized the true nature of their visit. "Are you threatening us?" "Threatening?" Snake's face took on an expression of mock hurt. No, we're offering a valuable service. Insurance, you might say. Right, boss?" Brick had lost interest in trying to provoke Daniel and turned back to Maria. "Times are tough. Budget cuts, aging facilities. Lots of things can go wrong. We can make sure they don't, for a reasonable fee." Maria's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I'll need to discuss this with our board of directors." Of course," Brick said smoothly. Take your time. We'll be around. His eyes swept the center, taking in the kids who had stopped their activities to watch the scene unfold, getting to know the community. After the bikers left, Maria found Daniel in the storage room, organizing supplies with his usual methodical care. Daniel, she said softly, what do you think about them? He continued arranging bottles of cleaning fluid for a moment before responding. Bad men are loud. Good men don't need to be. That's cryptic, even for you, Maria said with a weak smile. But I think I know what you mean. She watched him work for a moment longer. They're dangerous, aren't they? Daniel simply nodded, but something in his posture suggested he was carrying a weight far heavier than the boxes he was moving. Over the next few days, the Iron Wolves made themselves at home in the center's parking lot. Their bikes took up the prime spots near the entrance, and the constant revving of engines created an intimidating gauntlet for anyone trying to enter the building. Parents began keeping their children home, and teenage regulars found other places to hang out. Maria watched the attendance numbers drop with growing despair. The center was already struggling financially. They couldn't afford to lose more members. But every time she approached Brick about the situation, his responses became more menacing. The bikers started coming inside more frequently, treating the center like their personal clubhouse. One afternoon, they took over the pool table, breaking every posted rule about language and behavior. Children hurried past with scared eyes as crude jokes and cigarette smoke filled the air. Daniel approached the group, his movements unhurried but purposeful. "Excuse me," he said quietly but clearly. "Smoking isn't allowed inside. House rules." The room fell silent as Brick turned to face him, pool cue in hand. "House rules?" He took a long drag from his cigarette and blew the smoke in Daniel's face. "You don't give orders here, old man. In fact, I don't think you understand how things work now." Daniel met his gaze steadily, neither backing down nor escalating the confrontation. After a tense moment, Brick laughed and crushed his cigarette on the pool table's felt, leaving a deliberate burn mark. "Come on, boys," Brick announced. "Let's show the janitor how to play pool." He grabbed a cue and began making impossible shots, deliberately scratching the table and scuffing the floor with his boots. A small crowd had gathered to watch the scene unfold. Among them was Liam, the shy boy Daniel had helped before. He watched with wide eyes as the bikers continued their display of dominance. Brick noticed the audience, and a cruel smile spread across his face. "Hey everyone, who wants to see something interesting?" He pulled a table over and sat down, rolling up his sleeve to reveal a heavily muscled arm. "How about it, janitor? Let's see what you're made of." He slammed his elbow on the table, hand raised in the universal challenge of arm wrestling. The other bikers hooted and called out encouragement, while the regular center patrons watched in anxious silence. Daniel shook his head slightly. "I need to finish my work." "What a coward," Brick sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Just like I thought. Nothing but a broken-down nobody who cleans up after real men." The taunting continued as Daniel quietly went back to his duties, but those watching closely might have noticed how he gripped his mop handle, knuckles white with controlled tension. Later that evening, Earl Thompson, who had worked at the center for over 20 years, found Maria in her office. The elderly maintenance manager had seen his share of troubles, but the worry on his weathered face was new. "Maria, you need to get help," he said without preamble. "These guys don't back down. I've seen their type before. They'll keep pushing until someone pushes back." Maria ran her hands through her hair in frustration. "I've thought about calling the police, but—" She gestured helplessly. "You've heard about what happened to the Baker family when they complained about the Iron Wolves hanging around their restaurant. The next day, their place burned down. The fire department called it an accident, but everyone knows better." Earl nodded grimly. "They got people in their pocket. Police, fire department, maybe even City Hall. But there has to be something we can do. I just don't understand why they picked us," Maria said. "We barely keep the lights on as it is. What could they want from a community center?" "Territory," Earl replied. "It starts with places like this, soft targets, hearts of the community. Then they spread, like a cancer." He glanced out the window where several bikes were still parked. "And they're patient. They know how to wear people down." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. It was Daniel, coming in to empty the trash as he did every evening. Maria watched him work, remembering his cryptic words about bad men being loud. There was something about him, a certainty in his movements, a quiet strength that seemed at odds with his humble position. "Daniel," she called out as he turned to leave. "Have you ever had to deal with people like this before?" He paused in the doorway, his back to them. For a moment, it seemed he might say more, but then he simply shook his head and continued on his way. Earl watched him go with thoughtful eyes. "There's more to that man than meets the eye." "What do you mean?" "I've been watching him these past few days with the bikers. He's not afraid of them. And men like that, they can smell fear. It's making them nervous, though they'd never admit it." Maria considered this. She'd noticed how Daniel seemed to be the only one who could meet Brick's gaze without flinching. Even when being humiliated, there was something in his demeanor that suggested he was choosing not to react, rather than being unable to. The sound of motorcycles revving in the parking lot drew their attention back to the window. The Iron Wolves were leaving for the night, but everyone knew they'd be back tomorrow. Their presence had become a dark cloud hanging over the center, threatening to destroy everything Maria and her staff had worked so hard to build. As she locked up that night, Maria noticed Daniel's mop bucket still in the hallway, something out of character for someone so methodical. Following a hunch, she walked toward the gym and stopped in the doorway, surprised by what she saw. Daniel was there, moving with a fluid grace she'd never seen before, his limp almost invisible as he went through what looked like martial arts forms. His movements were precise and powerful, suggesting years of training. For a moment, she caught a glimpse of someone very different from the quiet janitor she thought she knew. He must have sensed her presence because he stopped suddenly, returning to his usual posture complete with the familiar limp. Without a word, he retrieved his bucket and headed for the storage room, leaving Maria to wonder just who she had hired 3 years ago. As she drove home that night, Maria's mind raced with possibilities. The Iron Wolves were tightening their grip on the center, but maybe, just maybe, they had underestimated one crucial detail. They saw a quiet janitor with a limp, a man who cleaned up their messes without complaint. But Maria was beginning to suspect that Daniel's silence wasn't born of weakness, but of choice. The question was, what would it take to make him break that silence? And when he did, what would they discover about the man who moved like a fighter when he thought no one was watching? The parking lot lights cast long shadows as the last car left the center. In the distance, the rumble of motorcycles echoed through the streets like rolling thunder, a constant reminder of the storm that was gathering. But storms had a way of revealing hidden strengths, and as Maria looked back at the building one last time, she couldn't shake the feeling that the Iron Wolves might have finally picked the wrong target. They thought they were the predators, but something in Daniel's quiet demeanor suggested they might be wrong. Dead wrong. And sooner or later, they were going to find out just how wrong they were. The pre-dawn air was crisp as Daniel pulled into the community center's parking lot, earlier than usual. From a distance, he could already see what he'd feared, garish streaks of red and black paint defacing the building's white walls. The Iron Wolves had left their mark during the night. Their wolf insignia sprawled across the entrance alongside crude messages and threats. He sat in his truck for a moment, studying the vandalism with careful eyes. Then, with deliberate movements, he retrieved his cleaning supplies and got to work. The sun hadn't yet risen when he started scrubbing, his movements methodical despite his limp being more pronounced in the cold morning air. Time passed as he worked, and slowly, the offensive marks began to fade. He had just finished removing the last visible trace when the first staff member arrived, Jenny, the art instructor, who gasped at the sight of chemical cleaners and water running down the walls. "Oh my God, was that Dash? Just needed a cleaning," Daniel interrupted quietly, wringing out his cloth. The walls were pristine now, no hint of the violation that had marked them hours before. Jenny looked like she wanted to say more, but the arrival of the first few kids drew her attention away. Daniel continued his normal routine, though those who knew him well might have noticed he kept himself positioned between the children and the newly cleaned walls, as if protecting them from even the memory of what had been there. Later that morning, the center hosted a community event, a small carnival fundraiser that had been planned weeks before the Iron Wolves arrived. Families filled the gymnasium, where game booths and activity stations had been set up. Daniel moved through the crowd quietly, emptying trash bins and keeping the area clean. The relative peace was shattered by the now familiar rumble of motorcycles. Brick and his gang swaggered in, their leather jackets standing out starkly among the family-friendly atmosphere. Parents drew their children closer as the bikers moved through the crowd. Brick's eyes locked onto Daniel, who was carefully maneuvering around a group of children with his cleaning cart. The biker leader nudged his companions, grinning maliciously. "Well, if it isn't our favorite janitor," Brick called out, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Still hobbling around like a broken-down horse, old man?" Daniel continued his work, seemingly oblivious to the taunt. This only spurred Brick on. "Hey, I'm talking to you, Limpy." He stepped into Daniel's path, forcing him to stop. "What happened? War wound? Or did someone teach you a lesson about knowing your place?" The room had gone quiet, everyone watching the confrontation. Daniel's face remained impassive, but something in his stillness made a few observers shift uncomfortably. There was an unnatural calm about him, like the eye of a hurricane. "Nothing to say?" Brick pressed, his voice taking on an ugly edge. "Maybe I should give you a matching limp on the other side, make you symmetrical?" Daniel simply guided his cart around Brick and continued working. His complete lack of reaction seemed to unnerve even some of the other bikers, though Brick's face merely darkened with anger. The tension might have escalated further if Maria hadn't intervened, directing the bikers' attention to the refreshment table. But the incident had cast a shadow over the event, and families began leaving early, casting nervous glances over their shoulders. Later that afternoon, Brick and Snake lounged against the wall near the center's main entrance, where a framed photograph hung proudly. It showed Thomas Anderson, the center's founder, surrounded by smiling children from the center's opening day 20 years ago. "Hey, boss," Snake called out, reading the plaque beneath the photo. "Says here this old guy built this place with his own 2 hands. Real pillar of the community type." Brick studied the photo with exaggerated interest. "Is that right? Sounds like a real hero." He looked around, making sure Daniel was nearby, cleaning the windows. "You know what I think about heroes?" With a sudden movement, Brick ripped the frame from the wall and smashed it against the floor. The glass shattered, and the frame splintered, the precious photograph now lying amid the debris. "Oops," Brick said with mock concern. "Guess you got more cleaning to do, janitor." Daniel stood perfectly still for a moment, his jaw visibly tightening. Then he knelt and began carefully picking up the shards of glass. His movements were controlled, but there was something different in his bearing, a tension that hadn't been there before. He rescued the photograph from the wreckage, handling it with surprising gentleness. Those who looked closely might have noticed his hands trembling slightly, not from fear but from suppressed emotion. That evening, after everyone had left, Daniel made his way to the storage room. In the far corner hung an old punching bag, dusty from disuse. For a long moment, he stood before it, seeming to wrestle with some inner conflict. Finally, he struck, a single explosive punch that made the heavy bag swing violently on its chain. The impact echoed through the empty room like a thunderclap. Daniel stood with his fist still extended, breathing heavily, as the bag swayed back and forth. The sound had drawn Maria, who stood in the doorway watching with wide eyes. She had never seen Daniel display any sign of violence before, and the raw power of that single punch told her volumes about what he had been hiding. "Why won't you help us?" she asked softly. Daniel lowered his arms slowly, his usual calm demeanor returning. "Violence just invites more violence. And what they're doing isn't violence." Maria's voice rose with frustration. "They're destroying everything we've built here. The children are afraid to come. Parents are withdrawing their kids. We're losing everything. There are other ways, Dash." "No," Maria cut him off. "I've seen you watching them. I've seen how you control yourself. You could stop this, couldn't you? You're not just a janitor." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "The man who could stop them, he doesn't exist anymore. I left him behind for a reason." Before Maria could respond, they heard voices in the hallway. Liam was there with his father, gathering his belongings from his locker. "I don't want to leave," Liam was saying, his voice thick with emotion. "It's not safe anymore, son," his father replied gently. "Those men, we can't risk it." Daniel moved into the hallway, his limp noticeable again. Liam spotted him and broke away from his father, running over. "Mr. Daniel," the boy said, fighting back tears. I wish I was brave enough to stand up to them. Like you do. Daniel knelt to meet the boy's eyes, his face softening. Sometimes being brave means knowing when not to fight. But they're bullies, Liam insisted. They're hurting everyone. Someone needs to stop them. The words seemed to hit Daniel like physical blows, but he maintained his composed expression. Go home, Liam. Be safe. As the boy left with his father, Daniel stood slowly, his face troubled. Maria watched him, seeing the conflict playing across his features before his usual mask of calm returned. The next morning brought a new crisis. Brick and his gang had arrived early, and Daniel watched through the window as they circled the parking lot on their bikes. He noticed Brick dropping something as they rode, small dark spots appearing on the asphalt. Maria arrived for work, hurrying across the parking lot with an armful of papers. Daniel saw what was about to happen a split second before it did. He was already moving when Maria's foot hit the oil-slick Brick had deliberately laid down. She fell hard, papers scattering in the wind, a cry of pain escaping her lips. Daniel reached her just as the bikers circled back, their laughter echoing off the buildings. Careful there, Brick called out mockingly. Someone should clean that up. Daniel helped Maria to her feet, his movements gentle, but his eyes burning with an intensity that made even Snake take a step back. For the first time, something showed through his careful facade, a glimpse of barely contained fury that made his hands tremble as he steadied Maria. I'm okay, she assured him, though she winced as she put weight on her ankle. It's just twisted. The bikers roared off, their laughter fading into the distance. But Daniel stood watching them go, his hands slowly curling into fists at his sides. Through the window, Maria could see his reflection, face still impassive, but his eyes held something she had never seen before. It was the look of a man reaching his breaking point. As the day wore on, tension hung in the air like static before a lightning strike. Daniel went about his duties as usual, but there was a new awareness about him, a coiled energy that made others instinctively step out of his way. Even the remaining children seemed to sense the change, watching him with a mixture of concern and anticipation. In the evening, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, Daniel stood at the window watching the iron wolves in the parking lot. They were laughing, sharing drinks, acting like they owned the place. His reflection in the glass showed no emotion, but his hands were clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. Behind him, the center's wall still bore the ghost of graffiti, visible if you knew where to look. The empty space where Thomas Anderson's photo had hung seemed to accuse him with its emptiness. And somewhere in the building, Maria was icing her swollen ankle, another victim of the violence he had tried so hard to avoid. Thunder rumbled in the distance, an echo of the motorcycles that had brought this darkness to their door. Daniel's reflection in the window remained still, but in his eyes was the look of a man who had just made a decision, one that would change everything. The storm was coming, and with it, perhaps, the return of someone Daniel had tried very hard to leave in the past. As lightning flickered on the horizon, he turned away from the window and walked to the storage room. The box labeled Kane waited in its dark corner, holding more than just memories now. It held a choice. The Iron Wolves had pushed and pushed, thinking they were dealing with a simple janitor. Soon they would learn why some men choose peace not out of weakness, but because they know all too well the price of violence. And as Daniel stood in the darkened storage room, his hand hovering over the box that contained his past, thunder rolled across the sky like the sound of a bell tolling, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The quiet janitor had endured their taunts, their vandalism, their cruelty. But watching Maria fall, seeing Liam driven away in fear, witnessing the systematic destruction of everything Thomas Anderson had built, it had awakened something that no amount of peaceful resolution could put back to sleep. The storm was coming, and with it, the ghost of who Daniel used to be. The only question was, would there be anything left of the quiet janitor when the thunder finally faded? The community center stood dark and silent under the midnight sky. Daniel sat in his truck across the street, watching. He hadn't gone home after his shift, something in his gut telling him the Iron Wolves wouldn't be satisfied with their usual daytime intimidation. The parking lot was empty except for a single streetlight casting weak yellow circles on the asphalt. His patience was rewarded just after midnight when 3 motorcycles pulled up, their engines barely more than whispers. Brick, Snake, and another gang member Daniel didn't recognize slipped off their bikes, carrying duffel bags. The streetlight caught the glint of spray paint cans as they approached the building's walls. Daniel waited until they had started their vandalism before quietly opening his truck door. His feet made no sound on the pavement as he approached, his customary limp absent. The fluorescent paint hissed as the bikers worked, adding crude symbols and threatening messages to the walls. "You boys are out late," Daniel said quietly. The biker spun around, startled by his sudden appearance. The shadows seemed to gather around his figure, making him appear larger than usual. Even Brick took an involuntary step back before catching himself. "Well, if it isn't the night watchman," Brick sneered, recovering his bravado. "What's wrong, Janitor? Eager to start cleaning early?" Snake circled to Daniel's left while the third biker moved right, creating a triangle around him. Daniel remained still, his posture relaxed but alert. "The center's closed," Daniel said simply. "Time for you to leave." Brick's laugh was ugly. "Or what? You'll mop us to death." He stepped forward, shoving Daniel hard in the chest. "You're nothing but a janitor. A nobody who cleans up other people's mess." Daniel absorbed the push without stepping back, his eyes never leaving Brick's face. This seemed to anger the biker leader, who shoved him again, harder. "Fight back," Brick demanded. "Come on, tough guy. Show us what you got." Snake joined in, pushing Daniel from behind. "Maybe he needs some motivation, boss. Something to get his blood pumping." The third biker grabbed a spray can and approached the memorial plaque near the entrance, a bronze marker commemorating Thomas Anderson's vision for the center. With deliberate malice, he spat on the plaque before raising the paint can. Daniel's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white with strain. For a moment, something dangerous flickered in his eyes, a glimpse of someone very different from the quiet janitor they thought they knew. "Don't," he said, his voice carrying a warning that made the third biker hesitate. But Brick was too far gone in his power play to notice the danger signs. "Look at him, trying to be threatening. You're a joke, old man. A broken-down nothing who dashed." Daniel's right hand shot out, catching the spray can just as the biker was about to paint the plaque. The metal crumpled in his grip, paint spraying uselessly into the air. The sudden display of strength sent the third biker stumbling backward. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Daniel deliberately unclenched his fist, letting the mangled can clatter to the ground. Without a word, he turned and walked away, each step measured and controlled, leaving the stunned bikers behind him. He drove home in silence, his hands still trembling slightly on the steering wheel. The house was dark when he arrived, exactly as he'd left it that morning. But instead of going to bed, he went to the spare room he never used. The box was where he'd left it years ago, gathering dust in the corner. He opened it slowly, as if lifting the lid of a tomb. Inside, carefully wrapped in old towels, lay the physical remnants of another life. Trophies gleamed dully in the darkness. Regional championships, national titles, and finally, international victories. Beneath them, newspaper clippings told the story. The ghost strikes again. Undefeated Kane makes history. Rising star sets sights on world title. Fight posters showed a younger version of himself, lean and dangerous, his fists raised and eyes alive with controlled violence. The articles praised his speed, his precision, his ability to seem to vanish and reappear in the ring. Hence the nickname, the Ghost. At the bottom of the box lay his old fighting gloves, the leather still supple after all these years. Daniel lifted them carefully, muscle memory making his hands form fists inside them. The sound of a car door closing outside broke his reverie. He went to the window and saw Maria's car in his driveway. She got out holding a laptop, her face set with determination. When he opened the door, she didn't wait for an invitation. "I knew you were hiding something," she said, brushing past him into the living room. She opened the laptop and turned it to face him. "But I never imagined this." On the screen, a YouTube video played, Daniel in his prime, moving like smoke through the ring, his opponent unable to land a single clean hit. The caption read, "The Ghost's greatest hits, undefeated MMA legend." "Why didn't you tell me?" Maria demanded. "All this time, watching those thugs terrorize us, and you could have stopped them?" Daniel sank heavily into a chair. "It's not that simple. Then explain it to me. Her voice softened, seeing the pain in his expression. What happened to make you hide who you are? For a long moment, he was silent, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. His name was Marcus Chun, rising star just like I was. We met in the championship finals. Daniel's eyes grew distant with memory. I was undefeated, hungry for the title. The fight was close, brutal. In the final round, I caught him with a combination, something I'd drilled 1,000 times. He stopped, swallowing hard before continuing. He fell wrong, hit his head on the corner post. The doctor said it was a 1,000,000 to 1 chance, but his voice cracked. He never woke up. Maria's hand covered her mouth. Oh, Daniel. I walked away that night. Disappeared. Changed my name back to Kane from the Ghost. I made a vow, never to hurt anyone again. He looked up at her, his eyes haunted. Violence only brings more violence. I learned that the hard way. But this is different, Maria insisted. The Iron Wolves are criminals. They're hurting innocent people. The children dashed are exactly why I can't risk it, Daniel interrupted. What happens when they come back with guns? With more men? Violence escalates, Maria. Always. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was Jenny, the art instructor. Emergency at the center. Everyone's here. Please come. They arrived to find the parking lot full of cars. Inside, staff members, parents, and even some of the older kids had gathered in the main hall. The tension in the room was palpable. Earl, the veteran maintenance manager, stepped forward. We've been talking, he said, about standing up to them. Together. It's our center too, Jenny added. We can't just let them take it. But Daniel could see the fear behind their brave words. These were good people, peaceful people. They weren't prepared for the kind of violence the Iron Wolves would bring in retaliation. Liam pushed through the crowd, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Mr. Daniel, they said they're going to burn it down. We can't let them destroy our home. As if to confirm the boy's words, Maria found a note shoved under her office door. The message was crude but clear. Tonight, everything burns. Try to stop us, and you burn too. She handed the note to Daniel, watching his face as he read it. Something shifted in his expression, a subtle change that transformed him from the quiet janitor into someone else entirely. He walked to the window, looking out at the gathering storm clouds. His reflection showed a man at war with himself, torn between the peace he'd chosen and the violence he'd sworn to leave behind. I made a vow, he said softly, to never hurt anyone again. He turned to face the gathered crowd, his decision written in the set of his shoulders. But I made another vow first, to protect those who can't protect themselves. Maria stepped forward. Daniel, you don't have to dash. Yes, he cut her off gently. I do. He looked around the room, at the faces full of hope and fear. Sometimes peace costs more than war. Thunder rolled overhead as Daniel walked to the storage room. The box labeled Kane waited where he'd left it years ago. This time, when he opened it, there was no hesitation in his movements. The old fighting raps came out first, muscle memory guiding his hands as he wrapped his knuckles. Each turn of the fabric seemed to peel away another layer of the quiet janitor, revealing the fighter beneath. As he worked, Maria watched from the doorway, understanding finally why he had chosen this place, this job. A man seeking redemption would naturally gravitate to a place dedicated to building rather than destroying, to nurturing rather than fighting. But sometimes, she realized, the greatest act of nurturing is standing up to those who would destroy what you've built. Sometimes the most peaceful choice is to fight. Lightning flashed outside as Daniel finished his preparations. When he straightened up, the transformation was complete. The limp was gone, his posture fluid and dangerous. The eyes that had been so carefully neutral now held a controlled fury that made Maria step back involuntarily. The ghost had returned, and as the storm broke overhead, Daniel, the ghost, Kane stepped out of the shadows he'd hidden in for so long, ready to face the violence he'd tried to leave behind. The Iron Wolves wanted to burn everything down? Let them try. They were about to learn why some men choose peace not out of weakness, but because they know exactly how much damage they can do. The quiet janitor was gone. In his place stood a legend who had never lost a fight, and he didn't intend to start now. The morning mist hung low over Pine Grove Cemetery, wrapping the headstones in a gray shroud. Daniel walked slowly between the rows, a bouquet of white lilies in his hand. He knew the path by heart. 3rd row from the cherry tree, 5th stone from the end. Marcus Chun, 1985 to 2014, beloved son, brother, and fighter, in peace we find strength. Daniel knelt before the grave, laying the flowers gently against the cool stone. His fingers traced the engraved letters, lingering on the word peace, a final message from Marcus's family that had haunted Daniel for years. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought staying away from fighting would honor your memory. But now—" He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Now I wonder if I've been a coward, hiding behind your death to avoid responsibility." The morning breeze stirred the lilies, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and approaching rain. Daniel remained kneeling, lost in memories of that fatal night. The roar of the crowd, the flash of cameras, the sickening sound of impact. "They're hurting people, Marcus. Good people. Children." His hands clenched in the damp grass. "I can stop them, but I'm afraid. Not of fighting, of what happens after. Of becoming that person again." He stood slowly, looking down at the grave of the man whose death had changed his life. Maybe there's a middle ground, a way to fight without losing myself." A weak sun broke through the clouds, casting his shadow across the headstone. "I hope you can forgive me for what I'm about to do." That night, long after the center had closed, Daniel stood alone in the storage room. The familiar smell of cleaning supplies and old equipment surrounded him as he began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. His shadows danced on the walls as he shadowboxed, muscle memory bringing back combinations he hadn't thrown in years. Left jab, right cross, left hook, each punch precise, each movement fluid. The limp that had become his constant companion vanished as his body remembered its true capabilities. He worked through his old training routine, sweat beginning to darken his shirt. High kick, pivot, elbow strike. The moves came faster now, more instinctive. In the dim light, he could almost imagine he was back in his old gym, preparing for another fight. The door creaked, and Daniel spun, dropping automatically into a fighting stance. Maria stood in the doorway, watching him with a mixture of awe and concern. "You're still afraid," she said softly, stepping into the room. Daniel straightened, his breathing controlled despite the intense workout. "It's not fear," he replied, unwrapping his hands. "It's the cost of fighting that I fear." "And what about the cost of not fighting?" Maria challenged. "Look at what's happening to the town." She was right. The Iron Wolves had escalated their campaign of intimidation. The previous night, they had vandalized the bakery across the street. Before that, it was the local diner. Each incident was accompanied by the same message: pay for protection, or else. "The police won't help," Maria continued. "People are scared. They're starting to blame the center for bringing the bikers here. Yesterday, someone started a petition to have us shut down." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I know. Then why dash?" "Because violence changes you." He cut her off. "It becomes a solution, then a habit, then an addiction. I've seen it happen. I've felt it happen." Maria stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "You're not that person anymore, Daniel. You prove it every day with how you care for this place, how you protect the children." Before he could respond, they heard voices from the main hall. Following the sound, they found Liam standing on a chair, addressing a group of kids and teenagers. "We can't let them win," the normally shy boy was saying, his voice carrying unexpected strength. "This center is our home. Mr. Daniel taught me that being brave doesn't always mean fighting. Sometimes it means standing up in other ways." Daniel and Maria watched from the doorway as Liam outlined his plan. The kids would organize a fundraiser, a community fair to raise money for better security systems and repairs. They had already made posters and started spreading the word on social media. "Even if we're scared," Liam continued, "we can still do something. Mr. Daniel shows us that every day. He stays calm, he keeps working, he never gives up, and neither should we." The children cheered, their enthusiasm infectious. Daniel felt something shift in his chest. Watching these kids he had quietly guided for years now standing up in their own way. Maria slipped away and returned moments later carrying something wrapped in brown paper. She mounted a stepladder, and began removing the empty frame where Thomas Anderson's photo had hung. "What are you doing?" Daniel asked. She smiled, unwrapping her package to reveal a restored version of the founder's photo, now protected behind new glass. Sometimes we need reminders of what we're fighting for. The photo showed Thomas Anderson on opening day. His dream of a safe haven for community youth finally realized. His eyes seemed to meet Daniel's across the years, challenging him, asking what he was willing to do to protect that dream. As Maria hung the photo, the sound of motorcycles echoed from the parking lot. The Iron Wolves had arrived for their daily intimidation routine, but this time felt different. There was a purpose to their arrival, a sense of impending violence that made the air feel electric. Daniel walked to his locker in the storage room, opening it slowly. Inside, wrapped in an old towel, lay his fighting gloves. He hadn't touched them since placing them there 3 years ago, when he'd first taken the job as janitor. His hands moved of their own accord, lifting the gloves, feeling their familiar weight. They were more than just equipment. They were a symbol of everything he'd been running from, and perhaps everything he needed to become again. This time, though, would be different. He wasn't fighting for glory or titles. He wasn't fighting out of anger or pride. He was fighting to protect something greater than himself, a community, a haven, a future for kids like Liam who were learning to stand up in their own ways. The sounds of the bikers grew louder, engines revving, cruel laughter, the crash of something being knocked over. Daniel slipped his hands into the gloves, muscle memory taking over as he secured the straps. When he stepped out of the storage room, he moved differently. The careful shuffle of the janitor was gone, replaced by the fluid grace of a fighter. His shoulders were straight, his steps sure, his presence filling the hallway in a way that made Maria catch her breath. Through the windows, they could see Brick and his gang dismounting their bikes, armed with chains and bats. They moved with the confidence of predators who expected no real resistance. "Daniel," Maria said softly, touching his arm. "Are you sure about this?" He looked at her, then at the restored photo of Thomas Anderson, and finally at the group of kids huddled nearby, watching with wide eyes as their quiet janitor transformed into something else entirely. "Some things are worth fighting for," he said simply. The main doors burst open as Brick strode in, flanked by his lieutenants. He stopped short at the sight of Daniel standing calmly in the center of the hall, hands gloved and ready. Well, Brick sneered, but there was an undercurrent of uncertainty in his voice. "The janitor's got himself some fancy gloves. You planning to clean us up, old man?" Daniel remained silent, but his stance shifted slightly, a subtle change that made Snake take an involuntary step backward. There was something about the way he held himself, something that spoke of thousands of hours in the ring, of victories earned through skill and precision rather than brute force. "Last chance," Daniel said quietly. "Leave this place. Don't come back." Brick's face darkened with rage, but for the first time, there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The quiet janitor they had mocked and bullied was gone. In his place stood someone else entirely. Someone who radiated a controlled danger that made the air itself feel heavy with potential violence. Thunder rolled overhead as the two men faced each other across the hall. Behind Daniel stood everything he had sought to protect: the children, the staff, the legacy of Thomas Anderson's dream. Behind Brick stood his gang, their previous cockiness somewhat dimmed by the transformation they were witnessing. The stage was set. The time for hiding was over. Daniel, the ghost, Kane had returned, not for glory or revenge, but for something far more important: the future of a place where children could feel safe, where community meant something, where peace was protected by those strong enough to defend it. As lightning flashed through the windows, illuminating the scene in stark contrast, both men knew that everything was about to change. The Iron Wolves had come looking for an easy target, but they had found something else entirely. They had found the ghost, and he was done running. The evening air crackled with tension as Daniel stepped out of the community center's main doors. In the parking lot, the Iron Wolves circled on their motorcycles, engines growling like predators sizing up their prey. The sound echoed off the surrounding buildings, creating a cacophony of mechanical menace. Daniel moved with fluid grace to the center of the lot, his previous limp completely absent. He stood perfectly still, hands relaxed at his sides, as the bikers tightened their circle around him. Through the windows of the center, faces pressed against the glass. Staff members, parents, and children, all watching with a mixture of fear and hope. Brick cut his engine, dismounting with theatrical slowness. His boots crunched on the asphalt as he approached Daniel, a mocking smile playing across his scarred face. "Well, look who decided to come out and play," Brick called out, his voice carrying across the lot. "What's the matter, Grandpa? Tired of hiding behind your mop?" Daniel remained silent, his steady gaze fixed on Brick. Something in that unwavering stare made the biker leader's smile falter slightly. "Nothing to say?" Brick continued, circling Daniel like a shark. "Come on, old man. Show us what you got. Or are you going to just stand there like a statue?" The other bikers had killed their engines now, forming a loose ring around the two men. The sudden silence felt heavy with anticipation. "You don't want this fight," Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying clearly despite its softness. Brick's laugh was harsh. "Oh, that's where you're wrong. I've been wanting this since the first day I saw you shuffling around with that pathetic limp. Come on, throw the first punch. Give me a reason." A younger biker, barely out of his teens, stepped forward from the circle. His leather jacket was too new, his eyes too eager to prove himself. "Let me show him what we do to tough guys, boss." Before Brick could respond, the young biker lunged at Daniel, throwing a wild haymaker. What happened next seemed to defy physics. Daniel's body shifted slightly, the punch passing harmlessly through the space where he had been. In the same fluid motion, his hand caught the young man's wrist, redirecting his momentum in a controlled arc that ended with the biker face down on the asphalt. The movement had been so quick, so precise, that several observers gasped. The young biker lay on the ground, clutching his wrist and moaning softly. "Go home," Daniel said, his voice still calm. "All of you." Laughter rippled through the gang, but it held a note of uncertainty now. They had expected an aging janitor, an easy target. What they had found was something else entirely. Brick's face darkened with rage. "You think you're tough because you can handle a kid?" He stepped forward, muscles tensing beneath his leather jacket. "Let's see if you can handle a real fighter." "This isn't necessary," Daniel replied, still trying to defuse the situation. "No one needs to get hurt here." "Oh, someone's getting hurt all right," Brick snarled. "You just embarrassed one of my crew. Can't let that slide, can I? What kind of leader would that make me?" He began circling again, but this time with the measured steps of someone who knew how to fight. "You know what I think? I think that limp of yours isn't fake. I think someone already taught you a lesson about knowing your place. Maybe you need a refresher course." Inside the center, Maria was trying to herd the children away from the windows, but they refused to move. Liam stood at the front, his hands pressed against the glass, watching his quiet hero face down the men who had terrorized their community. "Look at you," Brick continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "Playing protector when you can't even protect yourself. You're nothing but a coward in a janitor's uniform." Two bikers moved in from behind, thinking Daniel was distracted by Brick. Their mistake became apparent immediately. Daniel's body seemed to flow like water, ducking under one punch while simultaneously catching the other attacker's kick. In a blur of movement, both men were on the ground, one clutching his ribs while the other gasped for breath. The watching crowd fell silent. Even Brick took a step back, his confident sneer replaced by something closer to wariness. The way Daniel moved, it spoke of years of training, of countless fights, of a skill level far beyond anything they had expected to encounter. "He's not even breathing hard," someone whispered from the crowd. Inside, Liam tugged at Maria's sleeve. Is that really Mr. Daniel?" Maria watched through the window, her own expression a mixture of awe and concern. "Yes, but I don't think we ever really knew him before now." More bikers moved to engage, but Brick held up his hand. "Hold!" His voice carried an edge of fury as he glared at Daniel. "You've been holding out on us, Janitor. Or should I call you something else? Because those moves, those aren't something you learn pushing a mop around." Daniel remained in his relaxed stance, but there was nothing casual about his alertness. "Last chance," he said. "Leave this place. Don't come back." "Or what?" Brick's voice dropped to a dangerous growl. "You'll clean us to death? You think a few fancy moves make you tough? I've broken better men than you." The tension in the air reached a breaking point. Lightning flashed overhead, followed by a low rumble of thunder. The first drops of rain began to fall, pattering on leather jackets and creating dark spots on the asphalt. "This isn't over, old man," Brick snarled, backing toward his motorcycle. "Not by a long shot. You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The other bikers helped their fallen comrades to their feet, shooting murderous glances at Daniel as they retreated to their bikes. Engines roared to life, the sound angry and promising violence to come. "We'll be back," Brick called out over the growing storm. "And next time, we're not playing games. Hope you're ready for what comes next." The iron wolves roared out of the parking lot, their tail lights disappearing into the gathering darkness. Daniel stood in the rain, watching them go, his face showing the emotional toll of the confrontation. The violence he had tried so hard to leave behind had found him again, and there would be no going back now. Inside the center, the crowd erupted in excited chatter. The children, especially, were buzzing with amazement at what they had witnessed. Their quiet janitor had transformed into something out of an action movie, and the story was already growing with each retelling. "Did you see how fast he moved? Those guys didn't stand a chance. I can't believe Mr. Daniel can fight like that." But Maria noticed how Daniel's shoulders slumped slightly as he walked back inside, the weight of what had just happened, and what was still to come, visible in his bearing. The mask of the fighter slipped away, revealing the man beneath who had tried so hard to choose peace. "Are you all right?" she asked softly as he passed. He paused, water dripping from his clothes. "It started now," he said quietly. "There's no going back." Liam approached cautiously, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and admiration. "Mr. Daniel? Are they really coming back?" Daniel knelt to meet the boy's eyes, his voice gentle. "Probably. But this time, we'll be ready. We're not afraid," Liam declared, though his trembling voice suggested otherwise. "Not anymore." Daniel placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Being afraid is okay. What matters is what you do despite the fear." The storm increased in intensity outside, rain hammering against the windows and roof. But inside the community center, something had changed. The atmosphere of fear that had hung over the place for weeks had been replaced by something else. A cautious hope, a growing confidence. They had seen their quiet janitor stand against the darkness that had threatened their home. More importantly, they had seen him win, not through brutality or rage, but through skill and controlled power. It was a lesson none of them would soon forget. Daniel moved through the excited crowd, accepting their thanks with quiet nods, but his mind was already on what would come next. Brick and the Iron Wolves wouldn't take this humiliation lightly. They would return, stronger and more dangerous than before. As he retrieved his mop to clean up the water tracked in during the confrontation, Daniel felt the familiar weight of violence settling back onto his shoulders. He had chosen peace for so long, tried to atone for the damage he had done in his previous life. But sometimes he realized peace had to be defended. The rain continued to fall outside, washing away the scuff marks from the brief confrontation. But nothing could wash away the change that had come over the community center. The place that had been a sanctuary of peace had now become a battlefield, and its quiet janitor had revealed himself as a warrior. Thunder rolled overhead like distant drums of war, heralding the storms yet to come. Daniel worked methodically, cleaning as he always had, but his movements held a new purpose now. The time for hiding was over. The ghost had returned to the fight, and this time, he was fighting for something more important than championships or glory. He was fighting for home, for community, for the future of every child who had found sanctuary within these walls. The first strike had been thrown, and there was no turning back now. The real battle was just beginning. In the quiet of his small house, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, examining his bruised hands under the harsh overhead light. The knuckles were swollen, decorated with patches of purple and blue, familiar marks from a past life he'd tried to leave behind. He flexed his fingers slowly, feeling the dull ache of impact points he hadn't used in years. The digital clock on his microwave blinked 3:17 a.m., but sleep felt impossible. His mind kept replaying the fight in the parking lot, analyzing each movement, each decision. The muscle memory had been there, the skills unchanged by time, but something felt different. In his prime, fighting had been about proving himself, about the rush of victory. Now it felt heavier, weighted with responsibility and consequence. Was it worth it? He asked the empty room. The question hung in the air, unanswered. His phone buzzed with another news alert. The local paper's website had already published 3 different articles about the confrontation. He scrolled through the comments, seeing the community divide playing out in real time. Finally, someone stood up to those thugs. He's just going to make things worse. The janitor's got some moves. Great, now they'll come back with guns. The debate had spilled onto the streets as well. Walking to work that morning, Daniel overheard snippets of conversation that fell silent as he passed. Some people nodded in approval, while others crossed the street to avoid him. The quiet anonymity he'd cultivated for years had been shattered in a single evening. At the center, Maria was waiting in her office. She looked tired but determined. "The phone's been ringing all morning," she said as he entered. "Half the calls are parents wanting to know if their kids will be safe here. The other half are people wanting to know if the stories about you are true." Daniel began to turn away, but Maria's voice stopped him. "Thank you," she said softly, "for protecting us. But Daniel, we can't just fight our way out of this." He faced her again, noting the worry lines around her eyes. "Sometimes you have to fight for peace," he replied. "There are people who only understand strength, and what happens when they come back stronger." Before he could answer, Earl burst into the office. "You need to see this." They followed him outside. 3 businesses on their block had been vandalized overnight. Windows smashed, merchandise scattered across the sidewalk, walls spray-painted with the Iron Wolves insignia. But the worst damage had been saved for Joe's Diner, directly across from the center. The family-owned restaurant looked like a war zone. Joe Chun, the elderly owner, stood in the wreckage of his dining room, face red with anger. When he saw Daniel, he pointed an accusing finger. You did this. Not with your hands. But this is your fault." He gestured at the destruction around him. 40 years I run this place, no trouble. Then you play hero, and look what happens." Other business owners gathered, their expressions a mixture of fear and resentment. Daniel absorbed their anger silently, understanding their fear, but knowing he couldn't explain that backing down would only make things worse. After helping with what cleanup he could, Daniel found himself driving across town to a familiar neighborhood. Old Glory Gym hadn't changed much in the years since he'd last seen it. The same faded boxing posters decorated the windows. The same worn heavy bags hung in rows. The bell above the door chimed as he entered. The smell hit him immediately. Leather, sweat, and decades of determination ground into the floorboards. A few fighters worked the bags, their rhythmic impacts a soundtrack he knew by heart. "Well, I'll be damned." Gus Martinez stood in the doorway of his office, looking exactly as Daniel remembered him. Short, stocky, with graying hair and eyes that missed nothing. The old trainer studied his former champion for a long moment. "Heard you were back in the game," Gus said finally. "Thought I'd better see for myself." They moved to Gus's office, a cramped space cluttered with fight memorabilia. A younger Daniel smiled from several framed photos on the wall, holding various championship belts. "You can't take on a gang alone, Kane," Gus said, settling behind his desk. "Even you have limits." "I'm not looking for a fight, Gus." "No, because that's not what I heard." The old trainer leaned forward. "Word is you dropped 3 of them without breaking a sweat." "The ghost, back from the dead?" Daniel stared at his hands. "They left me no choice." "There's always a choice." "You made the right one." Gus stood, moving to a filing cabinet. "Question is, what's your next move? Because they're going to come back hard." "I'll handle it." "Like hell you will." Gus pulled out his phone. "Remember Tommy Martinez? My nephew? You helped train him after what happened with Marcus. He owns a security company now. And Diego Ramirez? That lightweight you mentored? He teaches self-defense to cops." Understanding dawned on Daniel's face. "Gus, no. I can't ask them to dash." "You're not asking." "I am." Gus's voice softened. "You're not alone in this, kid. Never were. Those boys, hell, half the fighters who came through here, they owe you. And not just for the training." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "After Marcus, when you disappeared, a lot of people understood why. But the way you helped others before you left, the time you spent teaching the younger fighters, that meant something. Still does." Back at the center, Daniel found an unexpected scene unfolding. Liam had organized a group of kids and teenagers, armed with brooms, trash bags, and determination. They moved from business to business, cleaning up what they could, offering help where needed. Mr. Daniel taught us that we have to take care of our community, Liam explained to a local reporter who had shown up to cover the vandalism. The Iron Wolves want us to be scared, but we're not going to let them win. The boys' words seemed to strike a chord. Soon, adults began joining the cleanup effort. Shop owners who had been angry at Daniel earlier now worked alongside the children, inspired by their resilience. Daniel watched from across the street, something tight in his chest loosening at the sight. These kids, who had every reason to be frightened, were choosing courage instead. They were fighting back in their own way, armed with brooms instead of fists. Maria found him there, watching the scene. "They learned that from you, she said quietly. Not the fighting, the not giving up. As the day progressed, Daniel began preparing the center for what he knew was coming. He worked methodically, installing simple but effective barriers on the doors and windows. The skills that had made him a champion now served a different purpose as he analyzed sight lines and defensive positions. In the storage room, he set up a proper training area. The old punching bag was joined by others, creating a space where he could work through the combinations and strategies he'd need. His movements were sharper now, more focused. Each punch, each kick was thrown with purpose, preparing for a specific scenario. Gus arrived as the sun was setting, accompanied by several familiar faces. Tommy Martinez, now a successful security consultant. Diego Ramirez, his lightweight frame still carrying the dangerous grace of a boxer. 3 others Daniel remembered from his fighting days, all successful in their own rights, all here because of a debt they felt they owed. "Nice setup," Tommy said, examining the barriers Daniel had installed. "But you'll need more than this." Diego was already working with the heavy bag, his strikes precise and powerful. "The ghost never could throw a proper left hook," he said with a grin. "Good thing you've got us to watch your back." As the group began planning and preparing, Daniel felt a strange mix of emotions. The guilt of drawing others into his fight warred with the warmth of their loyalty. These men had their own lives, their own responsibilities, yet here they were, ready to stand with him. Through the window, he could see Liam and his friends still working, cleaning graffiti from a wall across the street. The sky was darkening, but their determination hadn't wavered. In their own way, they were as much warriors as any fighter. "We've got company," Gus called out softly. A group of motorcycles cruised past the center, moving slowly, deliberately. Brick was at their head, his face dark with fury when he saw the gathering inside. They didn't stop, but the message was clear. They would be back, and in greater numbers. Daniel watched them disappear around the corner, his face set in grim determination. The calm wouldn't last much longer. Soon, the storm would break, and all the preparation, all the training, all the support would be tested. But as he turned back to his friends, to the kids still working outside, to the community that was finally coming together, he knew one thing for certain. This time, he wasn't fighting alone. And this time, he was fighting for something bigger than himself. The ghost had returned not for glory or redemption, but for protection, for community, for peace. And this time, he had an army at his back. The rumble began as a distant thunder, growing steadily louder until it shook the windows of the community center. Daniel stood in the main hall, watching as motorcycle headlights swept across the walls in increasing numbers. This wasn't just the Iron Wolves anymore. Brick had called in reinforcements from other chapters. "There must be 30 of them," Maria whispered, peering through the window. The bikers were armed with chains, baseball bats, and crude weapons. Their bikes formed a semicircle in the parking lot, headlights creating a stark arena of light and shadow. Gus stepped up beside Daniel, his face grim. "You don't have to do this alone." "Yes, I do." Daniel's voice was quiet but firm. "At least at first. They need to understand what they're really facing." He moved toward the entrance, his steps measured and purposeful. The familiar limp was gone, replaced by the fluid grace that had earned him his nickname. Behind him, Gus and the other fighters positioned themselves strategically, ready to intervene when needed. The night air was cool as Daniel stepped outside. Brick stood at the center of his assembled force, his scarred face twisted in a cruel smile. Look who decided to come out and play. Brick's voice carried across the lot. You're either brave or stupid, old man. Maybe both. Daniel stopped at the top of the steps, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the tension surrounding him. This is your last chance to leave, he said quietly. Take your men and go. Don't come back. Laughter rippled through the gang, but it held a note of uncertainty. They had all heard about what happened to their brothers in the previous confrontation. You're outnumbered, old man, Brick sneered, gesturing at his assembled force. 30-1. Those aren't odds even the famous ghost can handle. Numbers don't win fights, Daniel replied. Skill does. Let's test that theory. Brick nodded to his newer recruits. Show him what happens to people who disrespect the Iron Wolves. 5 young bikers broke from the group, charging forward with weapons raised. They moved with the reckless confidence of youth, expecting an easy victory against a single opponent. What happened next seemed to defy physics. Daniel moved like his namesake, flowing between their attacks with supernatural grace. A chain whistled through empty air where his head had been. A bat swung harmlessly as he slipped past its arc. Then he countered. The first biker went down to a precise strike to the solar plexus, folding like paper. The second caught a sweeping kick that took his legs out from under him. The third and fourth crashed into each other as Daniel redirected their momentum, their weapons clattering uselessly to the ground. The fifth, seeing his companions fall, hesitated. That moment of uncertainty cost him as Daniel closed the distance, disarming him with a quick wrist lock that left him gasping in pain. The entire exchange had taken less than 10 seconds. A murmur ran through the watching crowd. Some of the bikers took unconscious steps backward, their previous bravado dimming in the face of such skill. Is that the best you've got? Daniel asked quietly, his breathing steady and controlled. Brick's face darkened with rage. Kill him. Another wave rushed forward, but this time they were met by more than just Daniel. The doors of the community center burst open as Gus and the other fighters emerged, each moving with the practiced confidence of experienced combatants. The ghost never could handle being outnumbered, Gus called out with a grin, dropping into a boxing stance. The parking lot erupted into chaos. Tommy Martinez's security training showed as he efficiently disarmed and disabled opponents. Diego Ramirez's lightweight frame belied his devastating speed as he darted between larger attackers. But the real shock came from the town itself. People began emerging from nearby buildings, shop owners, parents, teenagers who had been bullied by the gang. They carried improvised weapons and years of pent-up frustration. The center is ours. Maria's voice rang out as she led the charge, Liam and other kids behind her with an arsenal of sports equipment from the center's storage. The Iron Wolves found themselves facing not just a few fighters, but an entire community rising up against their tyranny. Through the melee, Brick stalked toward Daniel, shrugging off his leather jacket to reveal heavily muscled arms covered in prison tattoos. You're not the only one with training, he growled, dropping into a practice fighting stance. 3 years in the state pen's boxing program. Undefeated. Prison fights are different from professional ones, Daniel replied, recognizing the stance from his experience teaching inmates. They circled each other, ignoring the chaos around them. Brick struck first, a combination that showed his training was no bluff. Daniel blocked, countered, testing his opponent's defenses. The two men traded blows with increasing intensity. Brick's prison yard brutality crashed against Daniel's professional precision. They were evenly matched, each landing telling strikes that would have felled lesser opponents. You're good, Brick admitted, wiping blood from a split lip. But I've got something you don't. Nothing to lose. He pressed forward with renewed fury, his attacks becoming more reckless, more dangerous. Daniel found himself giving ground, his defensive skills tested to their limit. A lucky strike caught Daniel's bad leg, sending a jolt of pain through his old injury. He stumbled, and Brick pressed his advantage. That's right, Brick taunted, landing another heavy blow. I heard about your weakness. The great ghost, brought low by a bum leg. What happened? Someone finally teach you what real pain feels like. The words struck deeper than the physical blows, bringing back memories of Marcus Chun, of the accident, of the guilt that had driven Daniel into exile. For a moment he faltered. Brick seized the opportunity, launching a devastating combination that drove Daniel to one knee. "Stay down, old man. You're finished." But as Daniel knelt there, he saw beyond Brick to the community center behind him. He saw Liam standing with other kids, watching with wide eyes. He saw Maria leading her impromptu militia. He saw Gus and his old friends fighting not for glory, but for something bigger than themselves. And he remembered why he had chosen this place, this life. Not to hide from his past, but to protect something worth fighting for. Daniel rose, his movements liquid smooth despite the pain. Something had changed in his stance, in his presence. The last traces of the quiet janitor fell away, replaced by the fighter he had once been, but tempered now by years of wisdom and purpose. "My leg isn't a weakness," he said quietly. "It's a reminder of why I fight." What followed was a masterclass in combat. Daniel's strikes flowed like water, each movement setting up the next in an unstoppable cascade. Brick found himself overwhelmed. His prison yard brutality, no match for years of professional experience, guided by absolute clarity of purpose. A right cross staggered the biker leader. A knee strike doubled him over. A precise elbow to the jaw sent him sprawling. But just as victory seemed certain, a glint of metal caught Daniel's eye. Snake, having worked his way behind the fight, raised a knife. "Mr. Daniel, look out!" Liam's voice rang out across the lot. The boy hurled a rock with surprising accuracy, striking Snake's hand. The knife clattered to the ground as Daniel spun, disarming the lieutenant with a quick wrist lock that left him howling in pain. The parking lot fell silent as Daniel returned his attention to Brick, who was struggling to rise. The biker leader expected a finishing blow, but instead found a hand extended to help him up. "Strength isn't about hurting others," Daniel said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's about protecting what matters." Brick stared at the offered hand, then at the scene around him. His men were scattered, defeated not just by superior fighting skill, but by the united strength of a community. The air of invincibility that had surrounded the Iron Wolves lay shattered on the asphalt. "This is our home," Daniel continued. "These people, this place, they matter. Remember that the next time you think about coming back." For a long moment, Brick remained still. Then, with a grunt of pain, he pushed himself to his feet without taking Daniel's hand. "Iron Wolves," he called out, his voice rough with defeat. "We're done here." The bikers began retreating to their motorcycles, helping their injured companions. Some cast fearful glances at Daniel, while others looked thoughtful, as if seeing for the first time the true meaning of strength. As engines roared to life, Brick turned one last time to Daniel. "You could have finished it," he said quietly. "Could have ended me right there." "That's not who I am anymore," Daniel replied. "Not who I want to be." Brick nodded slowly, understanding something that had eluded him before. Without another word, he mounted his bike and led his diminished gang away from the community center for the last time. The parking lot erupted in cheers as the last taillight disappeared around the corner. People hugged, laughed, celebrated their victory. But Daniel stood quietly, feeling the weight of violence lifting from his shoulders. Liam approached cautiously. "Mr. Daniel, are you okay?" Daniel knelt to meet the boy's eyes, wincing slightly from his injuries. "Thanks to you. That was brave. What you did. I learned from the best," Liam replied with a shy smile. Maria joined them, looking at Daniel with new understanding. "So, what happens now?" Daniel looked around at the community center, at the people cleaning up after the fight, at the bonds forged in adversity. Now we go back to work. There's always something that needs cleaning." Gus laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. "Some things never change, do they, Ghost?" But they had changed. The quiet janitor and the legendary fighter had finally found their balance. Daniel had learned that sometimes protecting peace meant being ready to fight for it, and that true strength lay not in the ability to hurt others, but in the choice to help them instead. As the adrenaline faded and the night grew quiet, Daniel picked up his mop and began cleaning the parking lot. But this time, he wasn't hiding from his past or running from who he was. He was simply being himself, a protector, a teacher, a member of a community worth fighting for. The ghost had returned, not to haunt his past, but to guard the future. And in the end, that made all the difference. The morning after the fight dawned clear and cool, sunlight glinting off the scattered debris in the community center's parking lot. Daniel stood at the entrance, watching as the last of the Iron Wolves motorcycles disappeared around a distant corner. Their engines echoed with diminishing menace, carried on the wind with muttered promises of revenge. "Think they'll be back?" Gus asked, joining him at the doorway. Daniel considered the question carefully. "Maybe, but not soon. And when they do, they'll find us stronger." The distant rumble faded to silence, replaced by the sounds of the community coming to life. People began arriving at the center, carrying tools, cleaning supplies, and determination. The damage from the previous night's battle was considerable, but there was an energy in the air, not of defeat, but of renewal. "Where do we start?" asked Joe Chun, the diner owner who had once blamed Daniel for bringing trouble to their neighborhood. Now he stood ready with a broom in hand, his earlier anger replaced by a quiet respect. Daniel picked up his mop, as he had done countless times before. "We start where we always do, together." The cleanup became something more than just repairs. As people worked side by side, stories were shared, bonds strengthened. Children helped sweep up broken glass while their parents patched walls. Teenagers who had once been too cool to care now worked alongside adults, sharing a newfound pride in their community. A week later, Daniel was cleaning the gym floor when he heard running footsteps. Liam burst through the doors, his face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Daniel, Mr. Daniel." The boy could barely contain himself. "You won't believe what happened at school today." Daniel leaned on his mop, giving the boy his full attention. "Tell me, remember those kids who used to take my lunch money? Today they tried again, but..." Liam stood straighter, his eyes shining. "I remembered what you taught us about standing up for ourselves. I didn't fight them. I just stood my ground and told them no. And they backed down." Liam's smile was radiant. "I was scared, really scared. But I remembered what you said about being afraid. Doesn't mean you can't be brave." Daniel knelt to meet the boy's eyes. "You did good, Liam. I learned it from you," Liam said seriously. "It's okay to be scared, as long as you don't give up. That's what you showed us when you faced the bikers." Later that afternoon, Maria called Daniel into her office. The space had been repaired after the fighting, now featuring a new addition, a framed photograph of the community coming together to rebuild. "The board met this morning," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "They want to create a new position, Director of Youth Programs. The salary would be better, and you'd have a real office instead of a storage closet." Daniel shook his head before she could continue. "I'm just a janitor, Maria." "No, you're not. You never were." She leaned forward. "These kids look up to you. The community respects you. You could do so much more." "I already am." Daniel's voice was gentle but firm. "Sometimes the most important work is the quietest." Maria studied him for a moment, then nodded in understanding. "At least let me give you a raise." That weekend, Daniel made a journey he'd been postponing for years. The Chun family home was a modest house in a quiet suburb, its garden meticulously maintained. His knock was answered by an elderly woman whose eyes widened in recognition. "Mrs. Chun," Daniel said softly, "I'm Daniel Kane. I came to apologize." She held up a hand, stopping him. "Please come in. We've been expecting you to come someday." Inside, he found himself sitting in a living room filled with photos of Marcus, as a child, as a young man, as the fighter he had been. Mr. Chun joined them, his face showing not anger, but a deep weariness. "We watched your fight on the news," Mrs. Chun said, pouring tea. "The one with the bikers. We recognized your style immediately." Daniel stared into his cup, the weight of years pressing down on him. "I'm so sorry about Marcus. The accident. I never meant." "We know," Mr. Chun interrupted gently. "Marcus knew the risks. He loved fighting, just as you did. What happened was just that, an accident." Mrs. Chun touched Daniel's hand. "Our son would not have wanted you to punish yourself forever. The way you protected those children, those people, that would have made him proud." As they talked, sharing memories of Marcus and the sport he had loved, Daniel felt a burden lifting from his shoulders. The Chins didn't just forgive him. They helped him understand that honoring Marcus's memory meant living fully, not hiding from who he was. Back at the center, Daniel began incorporating quiet lessons into his daily routine. While mopping the gym, he would demonstrate proper stance to watching kids. During his maintenance rounds, he taught them about discipline and respect. The lessons were never formal, but they were powerful in their simplicity. Fighting should always be the last resort, he told a group of teenagers who had gathered around him after school. Real strength isn't about hitting harder. It's about standing taller. Word spread through the town about the janitor who had faced down a biker gang, but people respected his desire for privacy. They nodded to him on the street, thanked him quietly for his service, but didn't pressure him to be anything more than what he chose to be. The center thrived in the weeks that followed. Membership increased as parents recognized it as a safe haven where their children could learn valuable life lessons. The Iron Wolves became a cautionary tale, their memory serving to remind the community of its own strength when united. One evening, as the sun was setting, Daniel sat on the center's front steps. The day's work was done, the floors cleaned, the equipment maintained. Through the windows came the sound of children playing basketball, their laughter carrying on the evening air. Liam emerged from the building, basketball under his arm. "Heading home, Mr. Daniels?" "In a while," Daniel replied, patting the step beside him. "Want to sit for a minute?" They sat together, watching as other kids left for the day, calling goodbye to their quiet protector. The sky painted itself in shades of orange and purple, the same colors that had filled the horizon on the day Daniel had first arrived at the center, looking for a place to hide from his past. "Do you miss it?" Liam asked suddenly. "Being the ghost?" Daniel considered the question. "The ghost was who I was," he said finally. "But this is who I am. Sometimes the best thing we can be is exactly what people need, even if it's just someone to keep the floors clean and the lights on, and to protect them when they need it." "That too." Daniel smiled faintly. "But the real protection isn't in fighting. It's in building something worth protecting in the first place." They sat in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky. Inside, the basketball game continued, the rhythmic bounce of the ball mixing with young voices and laughter. The sounds of peace, of community, of life going on. Daniel's hands, once used solely for fighting, now carried the honest calluses of a working man. His fighter's instincts, once honed for victory, now served to protect and nurture. The limp that had been his reminder of guilt had become a badge of his journey, a mark of transformation rather than shame. The ghost still lived within him, but no longer as a haunting presence of past glory and tragedy. Instead, it had become part of a greater whole, the quiet janitor who had found his true strength not in fighting, but in the daily act of caring for others. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Daniel felt a peace he had never known in his championship days. The roar of the crowd had been replaced by children's laughter, the pursuit of titles transformed into the simple satisfaction of a well-maintained home for his community. He was no longer running from his past or hiding from who he was. He had found his place, his purpose, his peace. And in the end, that was worth more than any championship belt or undefeated record. The quiet janitor of the community center stood up, ready to close for the night. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own opportunities to make a difference. But for now, in this moment, watching the kids play in the building he helped protect, Daniel Kane, both the ghost and the janitor, was exactly where he needed to be. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. 6 months after the Iron Wolves' defeat, autumn painted the town in shades of gold and crimson. The community center had flourished during the peaceful months, its membership growing as families recognized it as a safe haven where their children could learn and grow. But peace, as Daniel knew too well, was often temporary. The first whispers came from truckers passing through town. The Iron Wolves hadn't disappeared. They'd retreated, regrouped, and found new allies. A larger motorcycle gang, the Steel Kings, had absorbed Brick's crew, providing them with numbers and resources they hadn't had before. Maria noticed Daniel's tension one morning as he cleaned the gymnasium windows. "You've heard the rumors?" He nodded, his movements never pausing. "They'll be back. We're not the same town they left behind," she reminded him. Even as she spoke, a group of volunteers was installing new security cameras, paid for by community fundraising efforts. "We learned from you, Daniel. We learned how to stand together." Indeed, the town had changed. The neighborhood watch program Maria had started now had over 100 members. Regular patrols kept the streets safe, coordinated through a network of text messages and radio communications. Shop owners had installed better security systems, sharing the costs and helping each other. At Old Glory Gym, Gus had started a community defense program. 3 nights a week, he trained volunteers in basic self-defense techniques. The classes were always full, attended by everyone from teenagers to grandparents. "Keep your guard up, Mrs. Rodriguez," Gus called out to an elderly lady who was practicing blocks with surprising vigor. "That's it. Show them what happens when they mess with your petunias." Daniel watched these preparations with mixed emotions. Pride in the community's resilience warred with fear that he had started something that couldn't be stopped, a cycle of violence that would eventually spiral out of control. One evening, as he cleaned equipment in the center's weight room, Gus found him lost in thought. "I know that look," the old trainer said, settling onto a bench. "You're wondering if you should have handled things differently." Daniel set down his cleaning cloth. "If they come back stronger, then we'll be ready." Gus's voice was firm. "You gave us something more valuable than fighting skills, Daniel. You gave us the strength to stand up for ourselves. Let us help you this time. I never wanted to start a war." "No, you started a revolution. A peaceful one." Gus stood, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Look around. These people aren't learning to fight because they want violence. They're learning to protect what matters, just like you did." Their conversation was interrupted by Maria, rushing in with a package in her hands. Her face was pale as she handed it to Daniel. Inside was a torn piece of leather, part of a jacket bearing the Iron Wolves insignia. With it was a note, written in crude letters. "You can't hide forever, Ghost. We're coming for everything you protect." The threat was clear, but something about it felt different this time. The Iron Wolves weren't just coming for revenge. They were coming to destroy the very idea that a community could stand up to them. As word spread about the threat, an unexpected response emerged. Liam, no longer the shy boy who had hidden from bullies, called a meeting of the center's youth members. "They think they can scare us," he addressed the gathered kids, his voice strong and clear. "But Mr. Daniel taught us that being scared doesn't mean you have to give up. We can fight back our own way." The children organized fundraisers, car washes, bake sales, community events that brought people together while raising money for the center's security. Liam led these efforts with a quiet determination that reminded many of Daniel himself. "See what you started?" Maria asked Daniel as they watched the kids work. "They're not just raising money. They're showing everyone that this place belongs to all of us." The tension built over the following weeks. More rumors arrived, speaking of a massive gathering of bikers 2 towns over. The Steel Kings were reportedly hundreds strong, with chapters across 3 states. Daniel spent more time in the gym now, training with an intensity that spoke of approaching conflict. But he wasn't alone. Gus's fighters worked alongside him, each bringing their own skills and determination to the preparation. Tommy Martinez's security company provided advanced surveillance equipment. Diego Ramirez taught specialized defense techniques to the volunteer patrols. The community wasn't just waiting for trouble. They were preparing to face it head-on. One evening, as Daniel finished his rounds at the center, he found Liam waiting by the storage room. "I've been thinking, Mr. Daniel," the boy said seriously, "about what you taught us about strength." "What about it?" "You said real strength is about protecting what matters. That's what you did when you fought the Iron Wolves. But it's also what you do every day, isn't it? Keeping this place clean, making it safe for us." Daniel smiled slightly. "You're getting wise, kid. The other kids look up to me now," Liam continued. "Like how we look up to you. I want to do it right. You already are." Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of motorcycles. Dozens of them, maybe more. Daniel moved to the window, watching as headlights appeared on the horizon. This time was different. This time, when he walked out to face whatever was coming, he wouldn't be doing it alone. The community had transformed from victims into protectors, each person playing their part in defending what mattered to them. Maria activated the alert system she had set up, sending messages to every member of the neighborhood watch. Gus gathered his fighters at the gym. Parents came to collect their children, but many of the older kids, led by Liam, insisted on staying to help however they could. As Daniel prepared for what was coming, he realized something important. The Ghost had once fought for glory, for championships, for personal pride. But this fight was different. This was about protecting not just a building or even a community. It was about protecting an idea. The idea that ordinary people could stand up to bullies. That strength wasn't measured by the ability to intimidate, but by the courage to protect. That a quiet janitor could inspire a town to find its own power. He wrapped his hands slowly, each turn of the bandage a reminder of how far he had come. The guilt that had driven him into hiding had been replaced by purpose. The shame of his past had transformed into wisdom he could share with others. "Ready?" Gus asked, entering the room with a group of fighters. Daniel nodded, looking around at the faces gathered there. Maria with her quiet determination, Liam with his newfound courage, the volunteers who had trained for this moment, the community that had refused to be victims. "Remember," he said quietly, "we're not fighting for revenge. We're not fighting because we want to." He met each person's eyes in turn. "We're fighting because some things are worth protecting. Some battles need to be fought so that others don't have to." The rumble of motorcycles grew louder, but now it was met by the sound of car engines as community members arrived to stand with their protectors. The parking lot filled with people, shop owners, parents, teachers, ordinary citizens who had decided that this time they wouldn't watch from behind closed doors. Daniel stepped out to meet whatever was coming, but this time he moved with the strength of an entire community behind him. The ghost wasn't just one man anymore. It was the spirit of resistance that had taken root in the heart of every person who had learned to stand up for what was right. The final battle was approaching, but it wasn't just about physical confrontation. It was about showing the next generation that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the determination to face it. That true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the choice to protect. As the first bikers appeared at the edge of the lot, Daniel felt a profound sense of peace. Whatever happened next, he had already won the most important fight, the battle against his own demons. He had found his purpose, his place, his family. The ghost's legacy wouldn't be measured in victories or defeats, but in the lives he had touched, the lessons he had shared, the community he had helped build. And as he prepared to face this new challenge, Daniel Kane knew that his story, their story, was far from over. It was, in many ways, just beginning. The quiet janitor who had become a reluctant hero stood ready, surrounded by those who had chosen to stand with him. The night was young, the battle yet to come, but the outcome was already certain. Because some fights aren't won with fists alone, but with the unshakable conviction that good people, standing together, can overcome any darkness that threatens their home. The ghost had returned not as a fighter, but as a guardian. And guardians never fight alone. What would you do if you found yourself in Daniel's position? Would you risk everything you've built to stand up against injustice? Or would you choose to stay in the shadows? If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of unexpected heroes who remind us that strength comes in many forms. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that sometimes the most powerful warriors are the ones who choose peace first. Until next time, remember, every person has hidden depths, and every community has the power to stand together against darkness.